Hello there, my name is Craig Telfer and this is the Scottish Football Podcast. All the news, views and analysis you need on Tuesday the 3rd of February. The transfer window has slammed shut.
Back now with Engels. Just manages to find it. Oh, it's exceptional from Arne Engels. It is just out of this world from Arne Engels and Celtic.
Arne Engels remains at Celtic despite a £25 million bid from Nottingham Forest, but there was plenty of movement elsewhere as the final hours of the window got a little bit frantic.
We're talking about incomings. The Pittodrie exit door might also be pretty busy. That's because several Don's fringe players have been linked with moves away from the Granite Cities.
We will guide you through the biggest moves from last night's transfer action, and there's a huge match in the Premiership this evening. Can Heart of Midlothian keep on winning as the title race hots up?
Well, here come Hearts now, and it's Milne down the left-hand side. He's got it across, it's in! Kabore! Right in front of goal! Could not miss!
We have every angle of Scottish football covered right here.
The Scottish Football Podcast from BBC Sports Scotland.
This is a very big podcast with two very big boys to help me get through it all. Up first, he is Hottogo. He is the football writer at large for the Herald. He is Stephen McGowan. Stephen, great to have you on the show.
I'm not sure I can live up to that build-up, I have to say, but you set a high bar there.
And up next, he's the former hotshot striker with Falkirk and St Mirren, and he's been described as the voice of a generation. Rory Loy, thank you very much for joining us.
I'm not quite sure who described me as that. I think you might be the first, Craig, but yes, glad to be here as always.
No, that was in the notes the producer sent me for this, so I'm just incorporating that. But that's enough of the niceties. Let's get down to business, and we'll begin by analysing Celtic's transfer activity. And perhaps the biggest headline from Celtic Park was the decision to resist a £25 million bid from Nottingham Forest for the midfielder Arne Engels. Stephen, I'll come to you first. Why did Celtic turn down this offer, and do you think the club made the right decision?
I think Celtic are becoming a victim of their own dysfunction when it comes to the transfer windows now. Really, I mean, if you look at the last summer window, they got to the end of it and they had offers for Daizer Maeda, who wanted away. They couldn't take it because they didn't have a replacement. They had an offer for Yang. They had to haul him back up to Glasgow because they didn't have a replacement. They have had an opportunity to double their money on Arne Engels, a Belgian midfielder who, but the best one, was a very talented player, but hasn't necessarily scaled the heights people expected. And they couldn't accept that either. Because guess what? They couldn't land a replacement at the time available. Now, I think there's a feeling that the Celtic board take this view that the best deals are done in the final week of the window, the final days. Well, I think recent windows tell you that's not necessarily the case, because if you are a club who prides yourself in your transfer model and your player trading model, and you need to sell Engels to help plug the revenue gaps caused by going out of Champions League, then you need to do that. But they couldn't do it. And they couldn't do it because they almost seem, I think the perception would be that they seem a bit paralysed in the transfer market. Now, understand why they brought in some of the loan players, because they don't have a permanent manager, and there is some logic in that. I think it's only right to say that. But, I just feel that over the piece, they must have rejected that Arne Engels through gritted teeth, and they must wish it had come early in the window.
Rory, the club, as Steve mentioned, they have beefed up their attacking options by bringing in the Austrian international Junior Adamu on loan from Freiburg for the remainder of the season, alongside Joel Mvuka, who's come on loan from Lorient. Do you think they can offer the club something different in attack?
Well, listen, I won't pretend to know the full history of these players in terms of the ins and outs of what they'll bring specifically. You can watch YouTube, you can look at Wikipedia, you can do all these bits and bobs, but ultimately, whether they'll turn out to be a Nicholas Kudin or a Balakwisha, you just need to wait and see. What I will say is that Martin O'Neill's record at Celtic, he's been in charge for 14 games. He's lost one this season away to Michelin to get draws, Bologna and Hearts. That's two respectable results within themselves. He's averaging 2.5 goals a game. I think he's won 8 out of 9 in the league. Even without these players, Martin O'Neill's form is championship winning form. He must be sitting there thinking, all this noise around the transfer window is completely overshadowing what I'm actually doing in terms of what I've got, the squad I've got available to me versus what I'm actually, the output I'm getting. So I think he'll be hoping as well that if he can maintain that form, having added a few, because I posed a question on Sportsound to a Celtic fan on Saturday. I said, is it still possible that even without signing Celtic win the league? Because the form is unbelievable in the league when you look at it on paper. I think getting through in the Europa League and drawing Stuttgart adds a spanner into the works in terms of really needing to add to the squad. If they can get their key players back from injury as well, we'll wait and see is the answer, Craig, with regards to the new signings. It's impossible to tell, so I'm not even going to try and guess. Got good pedigree, potential to be good players. Some work, some don't. Let's see if these work.
I kind of think with that one as well, Rory, is I think you kind of alluded to it. I mean, so often a transfer window is a matter of perception, isn't it? And the perception can change in the blink of an eye. I mean, if Rangers don't sign a striker last night for 4.7 million, people perceive that they've not had as good a transfer window as they should have, and that their title challenge is not as strong as it might be. Celtic, they kind of rip up their plans to sign Mvuka for £3 million and they renegotiate to make it a loan deal. And suddenly the perception becomes that they haven't spent any money in the transfer window. Whereas, as you say, they might be okay, they might be perfectly fine with what they brought in, but the perception and the reality could be two different things.
Don't get me wrong. I agree with you, Steve. Don't get me wrong. Even if Celtic win the league, the way they've conducted their transfer business for a number of years, the ends doesn't justify the means. They should really, on paper, be getting the League One, in my opinion, with what they've got available to them. I know Rangers have come back and spending a bit of money now, but the ends, if they do win the league, the ends don't justify the means in terms of how they're conducting their business in the transfer market. But moving forward, we'll wait and see if they conduct themselves slightly different, because not being in a position to accept that bid for Engels is just outrageous.
I don't see how anything does change until the ownership changes. And I do wonder, I think you see that from supporters quite a lot, that this is a repeated pattern of behaviour now. And I mean, look, I understand there's a lot of heat on the chief executive, Michael Nicholson, his finance director, Chris Mackay. But ultimately, there's one man who's 34.7% of the club and 100% of the say, and that's Dermot Desmond. And I just wonder whether anything at Celtic or a model or a structure, which he says is fine, by the way, I just don't know whether that's going to change as long as the ownership is the way it is.
They'll get away with it this season because Martin O'Neill's still in charge and he's that good. It's, as you say, Steve, it's when the summer comes and they need to recruit, they're not going to be able to get somebody as influential as Martin O'Neill in. So if they continue to conduct themselves the way they are and they get the recruitment wrong, that's when serious questions have already been asked, but that's when things get really difficult.
We've touched on a bit of Rangers transfer business already, but let's take a look at them in a little bit more detail. Most of their signings were conducted relatively early. Tochi Chukwuani, Tour Romans, Andreas Skov Olsen are already at the club. Rory, I'll come to you. What have you made of them so far? Have you been impressed by them, or were you expecting a wee bit more?
I think Chukwuani's shown signs that he's got real potential to be a big presence in that midfield. I think he needs to tidy up a little bit on just his general play. Some of his passing's a bit wayward. Gets caught out in possession a couple of times as well. Easter Road, I was at the Dundee game and it was a similar performance, but I think his stature, his profile, his age, I think there's real mileage in Chukwuani potentially under Danny Role. Skov Olsen's been on the periphery. You don't want to be too harsh. He's just in the door, but he's shown nothing so far. He played 60 minutes against Dundee. He got the ball. He went backwards. He played it to his full-back. He played it inside the pitch. Against Hibs, it was a much more open game. I expected it to be a game for Skov Olsen. I know the pitch wasn't great, but a couple of times you get the ball and you're just waiting for him to do something. Doesn't look particularly quick. Yeah, he's got a nice touch. He's skillful. He's yet to make any impact in either of the games, which, again, it's early days, but really, at this time of the season, January signings, you're looking for somebody to come in of that quality and really make a difference straight away, and he's certainly not done that. I know they've added a new striker yesterday, so we'll wait and see how he gets on, but Chukwuani, I think, shows signs, a little bit raw, and he'll make a difference. Skov Olsen, after the first 2 games has been a bit anonymous, to be honest.
You mentioned a new striker there, Rory, and we'll turn our attention to Ryan Naderi, who's been signed from Hansa Rostock, a 22-year-old 6'4" forward, and he is the most expensive transfer from the third tier of German football. Stephen, Danny Rowe apparently very keen to bring him in. Do you think he can add something different to Rangers' forward line?
Well, he needs to, because I think there's a feeling that, I think we saw it at Hibs again at the weekend, that Rangers are excellent from set pieces, but they're not scoring enough goals from open play. They're just not converting enough chances. They're not posing enough threat. They're not having enough shots on goal. And I think the Derry is a big unit. I think they spent a lot of money on him because they had to, because I think Hansa Rostock were resistant to a move in this window without Rangers making it seriously worth their while. So I think they've had to up their bid at the last minute to get him in the door. They were obviously linked with Southampton's Cameron Archer. That hit a snag, and I think that forced Rangers to really kind of up the ante. So, as you say, Craig, they paid a lot of money for what is a Bundesliga free player. And there will be a lot of eyes on him. I think fans are pretty positive overall. I think Rory's absolutely right about Skov Olsen, but they've got Nader, they've got Chukwani, they've got Romans, Skov Olsen, and probably more importantly, they've got some players out. They've got Dowell, Rothwell, Inciala, Danilo, Cortez. There's talk of Rabbi Matondo going as well. So it's just a kind of evolution of the squad taking place, which bodes well under Danny Rowe. And I think, as I say, perception is everything in a window, and I think the perception of that window is that Rangers have done okay.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Rory, about the outgoing players from Rangers. Some of the more notable departures include Joe Rothwell going to Sheffield United, Clinton Neziala moving to the Belgian side Westerlo on loan for the remainder of the season with an option to buy. What have you made of the players that Rangers have let go? Right decision?
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt, yes. There's no question. I actually quite liked Inciala in moments. I don't think he made the odd mistake, but I don't think he's made any more mistakes than Nasser Gia, for example. But he's away. People underestimate how difficult it is to get people out the club, never mind into the club. If you're earning a handsome salary and the manager doesn't want you, and what reason would you have to offer your services elsewhere or be the first to go, do you know what, I'm going to uproot and leave and go somewhere else? It's very difficult to do. So the fact they've been able to do that is really good business. Rothwell naturally probably was quite happy to go back down to England, and you've got Inciala looking for opportunities, and then the likes of Cortez and others. It's best for them to go and play football, but sometimes it's not easy to convince them to do that when they're on good money. So they've managed to do that, and Stephen says the evolution of the squad. Watching the game on Saturday, though, just quickly on the football side of things, he played a 4-2-3-1. Chukwani and Raskin. I know when the ball's down the left hand side, Chukwani did get up with play, and vice versa on the other side with Raskin. But I'd quite like to see Chukwani in the play a 4-3-3. Chukwani just in front of the back four, Raskin and Diamandi further ahead. I don't think Asgard gives enough. So I think Chukwani's got that in him to dominate that area of the pitch. I don't necessarily think he needs Raskin in there. Push Raskin one further forward. I thought there was times on Sunday where they lacked an extra man in the box. Rangers players were looking up, they were getting into the wider areas. There's nobody really available. I think Chukwani's got the presence to safeguard the defence and screen the defence, allow Raskin to run forward, and all of a sudden you've got more legs up the pitch. I felt like Raskin and Chukwani together, it was just a bit unnecessary, is what I would say.
Right, that's enough about the Old Firm. Let's take a look at some of the activity across the rest of the Premiership. And there's been a flurry of activity at Aberdeen. Dennis Geiger has joined on loan from Hoffenheim, but Leighton Clarkson and Adil Al-Shish were two notable departures. Stephen, what did you make of Aberdeen's business generally? And do you think it's enough to turn around a campaign that's never really got going so far?
Well, you would say at the moment the bigger piece of business you really need to do is to get a manager in, wouldn't you? I mean, it's interesting because the German technical director Fanenstein, he's really made his feelings, he's made his presence known in here because he's brought in German midfielder Dennis Geiger from Hoffenheim. You have to assume would be in his initiative, but my goodness, they need to get a manager in. We've discussed in this podcast before where it's going to be probably an overseas candidate, I would expect. But they really need a name. They need someone to get it sorted, because what happened at the weekend there against Kilmarnock was pretty grim. I mean, it's interesting that reports say it kind of slipped through the net last night. They've offered a pre-contract to David Watson of Kilmarnock. I mean, Aberdeen have not confirmed that yet. But again, there's a high turnover at Aberdeen of the squad, but the most important move is to get someone in the technical area who's going to just put some spine through that club again.
Definitely, and we'll move to the northeast of Edinburgh. Hibernian's decision to sell Kieran Bowie to Verona in Serie A, arguably the most eye-catching piece of business in the country during the transfer window. They also loaned out record signing Thibaut Kliji to Randers in Denmark for the remainder of the season, but they did offset their departures by bringing in a host of players yesterday. Munash Garananga, Ante Suto, Felix Pasalac. Rory, what do you make of Hibs' business, and do you think they are in a better position now than they might have been prior to the start of the window?
Possibly. I was quite impressed with a couple of their new signings at the weekend. I thought Andrews came in and did well. And, Scarlett came in towards the end of the game and made an impact. You add the ones you've just mentioned onto the squad, and I think there's potential there. The problem is that, players get recruited at the last minute from such different places that trying to look into the ball and look at what they're going to bring and what they're going to do is tough, especially when it's done at 11 o'clock at night and you're in your bed for 10:30.
Lucky you. Lucky you.
But generally speaking, I think Hibs, listen, I do think they've underperformed at times this season. I'm not saying they've been fantastic over the course of the season by any stretch of the imagination. However, that being said, I do think they have been the victim of Motherwell and Hearts and success this season, and Hibs are not sitting in a bad position. If David Gray can get the finish to the season that he got last season, they'll finish strongly and finish well in the league. As for their new signings, I think they've plugged gaps where they needed to plug gaps. I think they've added a real bulk in their squad. They've got a lot of players to choose from, so it'll be interesting to see how it impacts the squad, but we'll just need to wait and see.
One of the success stories of the Scottish Premiership season so far has been Motherwell, and they managed to escape the final day of the transfer window by keeping their team intact, and crucially were able to bring back Stephen Welsh in on loan from Celtic. He really was in terrific form during the first half of the season. Stephen, how important is it to get back Welsh for the remainder of the campaign?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of these late ones that happened after Rory was in his bed. I mean, it was like, it was one of these, just I think it was announced after midnight. I mean, that was one of the kind of lesser seen ones, because Celtic brought in Benjamin Arthur from Brentford, kind of young defender who, as I say, hasn't played a lot of first team football, and you do wonder actually whether there's an argument for they might have been better off with Stephen Welsh, but I presume Stephen Welsh is keen to go back and get first team football again. So he's gone back there. But I mean, the big headline for Motherwell is a refusal to sell or entertain any overtures for Tawanda Maswanisi. 17 goals, and there was a rumour yesterday morning of Anderlecht coming in. People were absolutely bemused to think that Celtic and Rangers didn't have a tickle at that one, but I think the message of Motherwell was consistent all along, that whoever came in, they did not want to sell them this window. And I think that's quite a big statement from them, actually. And I think hats off to Motherwell for hanging on to him to the summer, because, my goodness, I don't know that anybody's necessarily saying they're going to be major contenders for the title, but they're going to have a heck of a saying who does win it, I think.
And in Dundee, they managed to keep hold of their star centre-back Luke Graham, despite a lot of interest from elsewhere. And they've also brought a well-known face in Scott Wright, the former Aberdeen and Rangers winger, joins on loan from Birmingham City for the remainder of the season. Rory, you think that's a good piece of business for Stephen Presley's side?
Yes, I do. I think that Cameron Congreve and Tony Yogan have had good seasons, more so Congreve. Yogan's been impressive recently at times, but their form fluctuates far too much. They don't score enough goals, Dundee. I think these players need somebody who's waiting in the wings to come on if they're not doing it, because the lack of goals is quite stark, to be honest. And when you consider, Ashley Hayes a good player, Simon Murray, of course, has got good record at that level of football. Congreve and Yogan don't generally nick in with goals either. I think adding Scott Wright and his tenacity at the top end of the pitch, his ability to go by a player and deliver it into the box, it'll do Stephen Presley a good turn. I want to avoid turns of phrase like he knows the league, etc. But you do want to avoid these things, but it is relevant.
Yeah.
But it is relevant because he's been at Aberdeen, he's been at Rangers, and he's been at Dundee before. That helps. I'm not saying it's the be all and end all, but it helps. He knows what it's like to be 8th, 9th in the Premier League in Scotland. He knows what it's like to be further up the league. He's got a real array and mix of experience there, and he's getting on in terms of his career. So he's able to give that experience and make it work for him and his squad. So whilst it is a bit of a cliche, cliches are there for a reason, and I think it's a decent signing.
Now let's turn our attention to tonight's match between St Mirren and Hearts of Midlothian at the Smythe Stadium in Paisley. The result of this match will have big implications at both ends of the Premiership. But before we preview the match, let's talk about two young strikers who departed the clubs to seek fame and fortune in the north of London. Evan Mooney left St Mirren to join Arsenal in a deal worth around £400,000, while James Wilson makes a temporary move from Hearts to team up with Tottenham Hotspur's development squad on a 6-month loan deal. Stephen, what do you make of these two transfers? Two of the more curious from this window.
Yeah, it's just part of a trend, isn't it? Whenever a young player in Scotland in the Scottish Premiership looks like he's in the verge of making an impact, he gets whipped away by a team from England, because I think this is one of the byproducts of Brexit, which is that because the English big guns can't necessarily fill their squads, their second and teams with European young players anymore, they're really turning their attention to Scotland and to Northern Ireland and to Wales. So I think it's a very interesting move. Evan Mooney was one of these. I remember seeing him coming on against Rangers and a win against Rangers and made a real impact. Looked a real good player. And I think St Mirren and Stephen Robinson get a bit of, not criticism, but just a bit of scrutiny, because it seems sometimes they don't develop enough young players. So Mooney was one people were looking at to try and do something. But of course, he's been whipped away, and that's a good move for him. Where it's a good move for him in terms of his first team development is an arguable point. James Wilson's interesting. I mean, Arsenal obviously were linked to him early yesterday. I gather that he was one that Celtic like as well, actually, but not for this window. It was never going to be for January. But then Tottenham appeared from nowhere in the afternoon yesterday. As you said, it's going to be a loan, a kind of stroke extended trial, where all his wages are going to be paid. And he's effectively putting himself in a short window, because it didn't look as if he was necessarily going to play much under Derek McInnes. So that's a really interesting move for a player who I think really looked like he was going to bust through and make a massive impact, but just seems to have stalled slightly. So interesting to see where that one goes.
Definitely. Good luck to both Mooney and Wilson. But on to the game itself, Rory. We'll start with St Mirren, with Kilmarnock beating Aberdeen at the weekend. It feels like the Buddies really need to take the 3 points to maintain that bit of wriggle room between themselves and the relegation playoff place. How do you fancy their chances against Hearts?
It's funny, isn't it? Because you look at Hearts' next two fixtures sitting there on Saturday night, and you think, or before the game kicks off, you think Dundee United away, St Mirren away, and although Dundee United are above St Mirren in the league, there's a tendency for some reason just to go, St Mirren away, that's a tricky one. And they managed to beat Dundee United, who are very inconsistent, hard to predict how they're going to be, very different to last season. And ultimately it didn't go their way, and Hearts blew them aside in the end. But going into tonight, I think with the turnover in the squad recently, the injuries they've got in the middle of the pitch, Bacchus, O'Hara, and bringing in so many new signings, I think it might be a bit tricky for St Mirren. Normally I would fancy their chances against anybody in Paisley, but it's been a bit stop-start this season in terms of the league. It'd be interesting to see how Hearts react if they end up going, a goal or two down. Because there's going to be times, and to be fair to Craig Gordon, he produced one at Dens. They've had moments in the last minute, but as the title race, draws to a conclusion, as it gets to the business end, as it gets to February, March, April, May, you've just got a feeling they're going to need to come up with some big moments in the last 5-10 minutes consistently, because that's what decides a title ultimately in the end. So it'll just be interesting to see if one of those times is tonight, because I reckon it'll be close, but I think Hearts might just nick it.
Yeah, and Hearts could increase their lead at the top of the table to 9 points if they get the win here. But Paisley is not a place where they traditionally do well. Every game seems like it's a must-win game for Hearts at the moment, and this one's no different, especially with Hibernian and Rangers on the horizon. Stephen, how important is it that Hearts get the victory tonight?
We keep on, every week, we keep on looking and saying, is this a week that the bubble bursts? The bubble doesn't, by and large, burst. And I think there's always been the point that Hearts didn't necessarily have to be perfect, because earlier in the season, certainly Celtic and Rangers were so ropey. I think even though Rangers dropped points at Hibs, I think there's a bit more consistency to them now. It looks like, as Rory alluded to earlier in the podcast, it looks like Celtic under Martin O'Neill are not going to drop nearly as many points, certainly not as they did under Wilfred Nancy. So, yeah, Hearts really need to hit the mark. They really need to keep digging out wins, keep digging out points, and they need to keep defying people. The people like us keep wondering when the bubble is going to burst, and that in itself is probably quite a good tactic for Derek McInnes to adopt before every game now. But, go back to perceptions. I think the perception is that they recruited well, they recruited efficiently in the January window. So I think they've got every reason to feel confident and positive going into the second half of the season when the business end of things, if you like.
If they can win this tonight and they can win the derby, then they go to Ibrox to go 9 points clear if they win that one. I think if that happens, then it's theirs to lose.
I thought you were going to make a big statement there, Rory. I thought you were going
to... Listen, Stephen, I'll say that if they're 6 points clear of Rangers going into the game at Ibrox and they beat Rangers and go 9 points clear, they'll win the league.
Yep.
But that's a big ask. That's a derby win and a win away at Ibrox. That's not easy.
And that's a very good way to finish this podcast. That is all we have time for today. My thanks go to Stephen and to Rory, and my thanks go to you, the listener, for tuning in. Remember, we are here with new episodes of the Scottish Football Podcast bright and early every day. So to make sure you don't miss out, subscribe on BBC Sounds and have push notifications turned on in your phone. I've been Craig Telfer. Enjoy your football, but please do so respectfully. Thank you.
On BBC Sounds. From life aboard a Russian submarine to chairman of Hearts Football Club.
At this stage, he was the hero.
But as his controversial decisions escalated...
They said, we're going to sack George. And I'm going, you can't do this.
How did Vladimir Romanov go from Hearts saviour to a wanted man?
He caused a whole load of chaos and havoc.
Romanov, Tsar of Hearts. Listen now on BBC Sounds.